It's time for Paleo Radio, only on Secular Media Network.
You are now entering Paleo Radio.
Welcome to Paleo Radio with your hosts Jeremiah Bannister and Joe Elder.
Welcome to episode 42 of Paleo Radio, live in studio, 95.3 FM, 1680 AM, WPRR. My name is Joe Elder. We have a fantastic lineup for you guys today. First segment is going to be Income Inequality and Why It Matters, an Associated Press article that was a really good read that I wanted to share with you all. Second segment, Trump campaign shakeup, what that means. It's going to be the third time that Donald Trump has had a major shift in his political campaign, but he's still trying to remain the same guy. We're just going to break that down. Third segment, Jeremiah is going to be calling in, giving us an update from the Team Tiny Dancer retreat that he is doing here, which is going to be away in North Carolina. And we're going to get an update about what's going on there. And our last segment is going to be all about climate change and how Arctic sea ice is melting at a faster rate than people thought was possible, and also what Bill Nye says about climate change. But the first segment is going to be Why It Matters, Income Inequality. This is, again, Associated Press article and by Josh Boak. Income inequality has surged near levels last seen before the Great Depression. The average income for the top 1% of households climbed 7.7% last year to $1.36 million. This is according to tax data tracked by the University of California, Berkeley. That privileged sliver of the population saw a pay climb almost twice the rate of income growth for the other 99%, whose pay averaged a humble $48,000. But why care how much the wealthy are making? What counts the most to any family is how much the family is bringing in. And that goes to the heart of the income inequality debate. Most Americans still have yet to recover from the Great Recession, even though that downturn ended 7 years ago. The average income for the 99% is still lower than it was back in 1998 after adjusting for inflation. So that's a really big deal. The numbers breaking down saying that since the recession, not everybody has recovered from it, and that's an obvious fact. But what does it mean when the middle class falls out? Well, because when you have this much of a wealth gap, there's serious problems with how money velocity goes around. And money velocity, for people who don't really know what that is it's how economics is focused on how many times currency is traded within a community before it's sent out. For instance, how often a $5 bill stays within a community before it goes outward. And that really matters. And the money doesn't go anywhere. The money doesn't go anywhere for a while. It stays in, and how often that travels kind of gives you an idea of how healthy an economy is. But when it sits at the bank, that's when it goes to someone who's wealthy. A wealthy person doesn't have to spend money as often. Obviously, if you give someone who's not as well off $200, they have a lot of things to spend it on. They have a lot of things immediately that they need that they're going to go spend it on. If you give someone who isn't that or who is very wealthy the money, it's likely that's not going to go towards anything, or it's going to go to something that's very lucrative. But most likely that money just goes in the bank. These people don't have the needs at the same level, and they don't affect the economy the same way when they get to incomes that are as high as we're talking about. Now, we're not talking about somebody who makes $150,000 a year. Somebody like that is not the big name player we're talking about. We're talking about people that are making millions upon millions of dollars, or even billions. Those people, they are not playing by the same game. They're not playing by the same rules. But there's instant value to the economic market if you give that money to somebody who's not well off. Since many Americans haven't truly recovered from the most recent economic downturn and pay hasn't risen with productivity, the result is the bottom of the middle class falling out. And that's something that like I've said, we've obviously seen. The first clip I want to play is by Nick Hanauer. He's a billionaire investor, and he had a TED Talks a program that was really, I thought, impressive. It was banned for a while, but then they put it back up for some odd reason. But I do want to play it. It's a really interesting take on how the middle class are the actual job creators.
Anyone who's ever run a business knows that hiring more people is a course of last resort for capitalists. This is what we do if and only if rising consumer demand requires it. And in this sense, Calling ourselves job creators isn't just inaccurate, it's disingenuous. That's why our existing policies are so upside down. When the biggest tax exemptions and the lowest tax rates benefit the richest, all in the name of job creation, all that happens is that the rich get richer. Since 1980, the share of income for the top 1% of Americans has more than tripled, while our effective tax rates have gone down by 50%. If it was true that lower taxes for the rich and more wealth for the wealthy led to job creation, today we would be drowning in jobs. And thank you.
So there's a great explanation of why the middle class matters so much. If no one is there to buy the items, then no business can flourish, and that's a fact. So when we have these explanations, even government does this as well, where they'll say they're the job creators or we've created X amount of jobs. Really, the job creation is totally indicative upon how many people are going into the middle class or out of the middle class. When we have a recession, that's because people in the middle class could no longer afford the items that are absolutely in the middle. You know, going to the market every day, that sort of thing, going into Walmart, paying those type of bills. That's something that the average middle class is doing, and when there's less of those people involved in it, obviously you see a shakeup in the market. So I think that that's an absolute fact that we have to adjust ourselves to believing and buying into, is knowing that the middle class is the real group that's moving the dial economically for Americans. So if we take that up, when we see businesses that can make billions of dollars in their net income, and they're paying people on the bottom scale, and then they're demanding that those people get involved, or not demanding, but just by way of situation, having those people get involved with government assistance, you're seeing corporate welfare at play. Obviously, corporate welfare at play. A couple of companies that come to mind, McDonald's, Walmart, people that make billions of dollars a year, and in the CEO's office, you have millions of dollars being rolled in there. I mean, 8 times the amount that the lowest worker is paid. And you have to think about that. If they're making that much money, how in the world is the amount of people doing all that work not a higher wage? And it is in other countries. If you go to the Netherlands, they'd pay what would be a U.S. rate of close to $20? Because they have unions and they have protectionism there. But we don't. And I think that's something that's important, is we need to focus on where our jobs are. And our jobs are in the service industry. Their manufacturing is something that we need to focus on, but the thing we need to focus on more is the service industry. And this is what the presidential candidates have said, going back to the AP article. Hillary Clinton has highlighted the inequality in multiple speeches, but with her positions evolving somewhat over the past year. Bernie Sanders held her feet to the fire on that subject in the primaries. Clinton hopes to redirect more money to the middle class and the impoverished. Clinton would raise taxes on the wealthy, increase the federal minimum wage, boost infrastructure spending, provide universal pre-K and offer the prospect of tuition-free college. Now, we'll see about that. I'm pretty skeptical on her position changing this much in only one election cycle. We have to remember that platforms here during presidential campaigns are more symbolic than they are factual, and that's really kind of the way the mop flops. And they're only there to garnish the middle-of-the-road voters. I would be floored if Hillary Clinton really proposed something like tuition-free college if she got in office. I'd be absolutely floored. So going over to Donald Trump, Trump offers a more blunt message about the hollowed-out middle class and a system that's rigged against the average American. Still, he has yet to emphasize income inequality in the campaign. To bring back the factory jobs long associated with the rise of the middle class, Trump has promised new trade deals and infrastructure spending. But Trump has also promised a tax plan that would allow the wealthiest Americans to keep more of their earnings. And I think Trump's position in this argument is basically the one for the yesteryears, like I was talking about just a moment ago. We just need more factory jobs is not a long-term solution anymore. Most of the jobs in the United States are in the service industry, and I think it would be wiser to focus on where we're gaining more substantial pay and where it would make a bigger impact. And we can't just be looking to try to pick up the scraps of the industrial age. There's always going to be American manufacturing, and I think it's important, but I also think it's lost its position as the backbone of the American economy. Even in those jobs, if they are recovered, automation is happening so fast that we'd be back to the drawing board in about 25 years, I would guess, and back to the same issue. So we need to look at how the industry's changed. It's changed to the service industry. And going into the AP article, President Barack Obama has called rising inequality, quote, the defining challenge of our time. And experts warn that it may be slowing overall economic growth. Greater inequality has created a festering distrust of the government and of corporate leaders whose promise to better times ahead has never fully materialized. The result has been a backlash against globalization that many Americans feel tilted in the economy and that it's tilted against them. For the top 1%, the ability to move money overseas and reach markets worldwide concentrated pay for superstars, according to the economists. And at the same time, factory workers now compete with 3 billion people in China, India, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere who weren't working for the multinational corporations 20 years ago. Many now make products for Apple, Intel, General Motors, and others at very low wages. This is depressed middle-class pay. These trends have contributed to a hollowed-out labor market in the United States, with more jobs at a higher and lower end at the pay scale than fewer in the middle. And this is what I mean when I say the focus should be on the service industry. This is absolutely where there's most jobs, and it's where you can really adjust the pay scales. The average age for the fast food worker is 26 right now. So that's not a summer job anymore. That's not a make some walk around money job. It's a pay my bills job. And this is an interesting quote because it's coming from an interesting man. But Jesse Ventura brings up something on the Big Think that I thought was really important. I'm going to play that. And this is him talking about income inequality and also proposing maybe a maximum wage.
Wealth distribution's completely out of line today. In fact, people have talked to me about the minimum wage, and I've shocked people and said, maybe what we ought to have is a maximum wage. If somebody makes $100 million a year, that's not enough. What could you possibly need if you made $100 million every year? And the case in point, the Walton family, right, that owns Walmart. Each member of that family makes billions of dollars a year, and yet their employees have to be government subsidized by we the taxpayers because they don't earn enough to not be subsidized. Something is gravely wrong with that. My position on that is if you work a 40-hour work week, I don't give a damn what the job is. If you work 40 hours a week, you should get paid enough money so that you do not require any government subsidy at all. Now, how you determine that or what that number is, we got to figure it out. But to me, if you work 40 hours a week shining shoes, washing dishes, whatever that might be, you should earn a living to where we, the government and the taxpayers, should not have to be subsidizing you.
And that's the crux of the issue there, folks. Should someone in America working 40 hours at any job be paid low enough to receive government benefits? And I think the answer is no. We shouldn't subsidize bad employers relying on the government dole. Let's make a concentrated focus to elect people who focus on raising the minimum wage and lowering corporate and individual welfare.
Love Paleo Radio? Join the club. Support our work by visiting patreon.com/Paleo Radio today.
Back to Eagle and Dragon.
Welcome back to Paleo Radio, live in studio, WPRR 95.3 FM, 1680 AM. Donald Trump's shakeup gamble. This is an article out of CNN by Maeve Reston. Donald Trump's reshuffling of his staff this week portends a risky pivot, a bare-knuckled, outsider-focused effort where no tactic for taking down Hillary Clinton will be off limits. Now, this is because his poll numbers have been dropping. Donald Trump, again, he loves the polls when they're behind him and he hates the polls when they're not. And we're seeing this shakeup happen. It's pretty expected. I think we know what we're getting out of Donald Trump, where when things go down a little bit, the people around him suffer. And this is no different. His plummeting poll numbers suggest that he's cruising towards defeat in November unless he's able to drastically change course. But it's unclear how his leadership changes will help Trump reverse his core problems, his murky message, a scattershot ground game, and his unwillingness to appeal to a broader group of voters. And I don't believe he's going to change. I just simply don't. He said enough times that he's not going to change. And I think that he's not going to be ushering a new large swath of voters. He just is not going to be able to pivot. Number one, like I said, he said he's not going to. But even if he does, it's going to seem kind of half-hearted at best. And he's made it clear in his run to the RNC that his campaign focus is predominantly on white, more nationalistic folks. And you can take some of those positions, but you won't be able to walk them back. You can get the RNC when you have those nationalistic positions, but when you get to the broader nation, it's a struggle. And it's something that a lot of people have said was going to be Donald Trump's struggle, is that when you're in the Republican caucus and in the Republican convention and campaigning there, the group that's paying attention to the voting is much, much different than the entire nation. And you can see that in just a scattershot photo of the parties or at their conventions with just the diversity there. And yes, I'm being overtly suggestive that it's a very white party and it has a central focus on a central demographic, and that demographic is getting smaller and smaller. Going back into the article, Steve Bannon, who's the executive chairman of the right-wing group, or the right-wing site, Breitbart News, is now the Trump campaign's chief executive. Bannon's addition to the team was a surprising twist that befuddled many Republicans Wednesday, given his lack of experience running campaigns. Trump's former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, likened Bannon to a street fighter. So we've gone from Lewandowski to Manafort and now to Bannon. And Trump really has got the whole "you're fired" thing down at this point, I think. But I see serious problems there, too. Is that what a presidential cabinet is going to look like? A rotating door of officials that Trump just wants in or out on a whim? It's obvious that people are having a hard time getting Trump to collect himself. And I think that he's going to be on the national stage. And as we see his polls dip, we're just going to see him devolve more and more into a mess. The campaign is going to fall apart. And I really do think so. The thing is, when you have a man who's stubborn, when things get bad, they typically buckle down. And Donald Trump is obviously stubborn, and I think he's obviously going to buckle down. I don't see him being coy enough to make a change. And if he is, like I've already said, people are going to see right through that. It's going to be half-hearted at best. You won't see a full pivot. And if you do, he's going to lose his base that he's been focused on collecting for the last year. And there's also a problem with the journalistic news source that has their executive chairman as Trump's campaign executive. I think there's just massive problems there in general with a conflict of interest. Campaign officials frame the staff changes as a typical expansion of the team weeks before the voting begins. But Trump's reshuffling signaled that how he has been chafed under the guidance of the campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, one of the few people around in the real estate mogul who was unafraid to confront him about his shortcomings in his candidacy. So Manafort is kind of seen as a truth teller, but that's not entirely true in itself either, because Paul Manafort really, he has some connections to political parties in Ukraine that he's helped and moved some money around for. And in fact, there's a criminal investigation opening up right now to see if his relationship with those political parties was criminal indeed. So we're going to have a little bit more on that in a few weeks. But we do know that he's had some serious connections there, and Manafort is not necessarily your best guy to have leading the campaign in the first place. So he's not entirely out of Trump's campaign. He's moved to the side for Steve Bannon to enter. So just to be clear, he didn't totally pull the "you're fired" on Manafort. He did throw him out, but he didn't throw him entirely out of the ring. Excuse me. Paul Manafort is this guy, I'm telling you. The only thing that we have to really stress is that as we're looking at what's gone on with the Hillary Clinton Foundation and how she's moving money around and how she's connected with political officials overseas, we're seeing the same thing in Manafort. So you can pretty much guarantee that both parties that have people involved in their political group have done this sort of thing. They've played ball with a lot of different political groups overseas, and money has changed hands. So that's just a concern for any American, I would have to say. Back into the article, Trump's overall feeling is that he still has a chance to win, but if he loses, he wants to lose his way, running the kind of campaign that he wants to run. And that approach would mean more big rallies, freewheeling interviews on TV, and a streamlined focus on battleground states. But with Bannon at the helm, Democrats are now bracing for a far more personal onslaught against Hillary Clinton this fall. It's a risky approach, and given Clinton's standing among voters, has sometimes improved when she's perceived as the victim of his attacks. So that's an interesting thing to say, is that maybe the hardcore onslaught on Clinton may just turn around on him. People might get sick of it. And I think if you run the whole RNC gambit on just calling people names, by the time you get to the presidential pulpit and you're arguing that and debating that on that stage, people are going to be really sick of it. Not even writing about it, just kind of plain sick of it, wanting to hear something else, be interested in something else. And I think that's where we're going to see a real shakeup there with old DT. And Robbie Mook, who is Clinton's campaign manager, told reporters during a Wednesday conference call that the Democrat is expecting more divisive rhetoric from the new team, which is obvious. Breitbart is it's a publication. I honestly do read some Breitbart. I think that just like any news source, they have their own political slant, but it's worth noting that they have some good writers over there. They have some good contributors, and I think that staying open to a website is important. So the way that they've been portrayed in the article is not necessarily entirely just, because I think that Breitbart does have some legitimate writers over there. And I think CNN just calling them straight right-wing and kind of the dark-wing duck of news is a little disingenuous. But we have a clip here of Michael Cohen, who's the Trump Organization exec, who is on CNN, basically denying that Trump is down in the polls and asking the CNN anchor what polls he's down in, which was just kind of a laugh. It was something I felt we needed to share, so here you go.
You say it's not a shakeup, but you guys are down. And it makes
Says
sense
who?
that there would...
Says
polls,
who?
most of them. All of them?
Says who?
Polls. I just told you. I answered your question.
Okay. Which polls?
All of them.
Okay. And your question is?
Okay, so my question is, I don't think it is really surprising when facing a challenge and trying to make a turnaround that there would be some, let's at least say some adjustments, okay?
Okay, so what polls, he asked. This is just for anyone who's wondering what polls he is referring to. The Reuters poll has Clinton at 41 and Trump at 36. The LA Times, the USC poll has Clinton at 45 and Trump at 43. The Economist has Clinton at 47 and Trump at 41. NBC News has Clinton at 50 and Trump at 41. Bloomberg has Clinton at 50, Trump at 44. ABC News Washington Post poll has Clinton at 50 and Trump at 42. So when he's asking what polls, it would be those polls. Those are the ones that we're talking about when we're saying what Clinton is ahead in. It's just pretty obvious. Now, it's the job of the campaign manager there to try to turn around the rhetoric and say that this has not been a shakeup. This is an addition to the team. We're a wonderful, fantastic group. Everything's going great. We're competing. We're not losing in the polls. But it's just, honestly, it's being disingenuous at this point. Again, the thing to note is how much this group loves polls when it's in their favor and how much they despise them or act like they don't even exist in other senses. And I think that that is a very legitimate thing to bring up. But there's so much work to be done here in the Trump campaign, and we're going to see if he's going to surge back. But my opinion is that it's going to be awfully tough, and he's worked himself into a corner with minorities and young voters. And I mean, this is the statistic that people need to hear. Donald Trump polling around 20% with people under 35 in the U.S. And I know we talked about this last week, but think about that. Under 20% of people that are 35 or under in the voting booths. What does that mean for Republicans in the future if they stick with Trump? Or what does that even mean for Trump's campaign in the future in 4 years? Is that everybody that's coming from the generations younger really is not liking this rhetoric. They don't buy in anymore. And I think that's something that people are struggling to see. And when we're seeing the anger in the Donald Trump campaign and we're seeing all this this angry rhetoric that's coming from the folks that are in the crowd, when we're seeing all of that happen, I think that is a reaction to what they perceive as a changing of morals in America because they're seeing a change of color in the people. And I really do. I believe that they're seeing their states or they're seeing their cities become more diverse, and they think that's bringing in different morals and different values. That is just untrue. People culturally have a general accepted morale here in America. You can see that because people assimilate really well in America. For instance, I know I've said a lot of things about people in Islam and the faith of Islam and those beliefs, but I can tell you that people that are here in America typically don't hold those radical ideals because there is a general accepted premise of free speech and there's a general accepted premise of separation of church and state. And that's a really valuable thing. It's a valuable thing that we can teach others, but it's an important thing to say because when people look around and they see the diversity happening in their city, that is not a bad thing. That's not a negative thing. And it's funny that you even have to have this conversation, but I think that's the one that you need to be having with your average Trump supporter. Now, and I'm not trying to be disingenuous because I do know a lot of people that are very intelligent that say they're going to vote for Donald Trump. They also are people that have been on the more anarchistic side, and there are also people who have been on the very disenchanted side of politics. And that's not a surprise. A lot of people are joining into that group more and more. But I think it's important to look at those people and think, what is this about? Now, for the average Donald Trump supporter, I think it's about the reaction to their very immediate circumstances changing, the people that they're competing with changing. I think that's extremely important, and I think that's something that they are concerned with. I think that's what we need to be talking about with those groups. I think that that's the central focus here, is what do we do with people when they want to focus on the race issues? Well, let's talk about race then. Let's make it a race issue and say, why do you feel like your morals are changing when you see the group change? That is something that needs to be argued and argued out very thoroughly, and it's something that we can't take and can't be embarrassed about. Up next at 2:30, we're going to have a call from Jeremiah in North Carolina. Stick around, Paleo Radio.
You love to hate 'em, you hate to love 'em. You just can't get enough of 'em, you sick freaks. Paleo Radio's on the air.
Hey, welcome back to Paleo Radio, live in studio, 95.3 FM, 1680 AM. My name's Joe Elder. There is a number here you can call in live, 616-656-1680. The topic today, that we're going to finish off with, is Bill Nye talking about climate change and also how Arctic sea ice is vanishing far faster than anyone had thought possible, which is an article from Robert Ferris out of CNBC. But first, this is about a 3 or 4 minute clip of Bill Nye just explaining climate change and how important it is. And I think it's very encapsulating. It's got a lot of evidence in there, a lot of things that people need to understand about climate change. So we're going to just begin with that clip.
We hear it so much that it feels like a buzzword, but it is far from it. Climate change is a real and serious issue. But isn't the climate always changing? What exactly is climate change, and why should we care? Well, the Earth's climate has changed throughout history. Most of these slight changes are caused by small variations in the Earth's orbit. But climate change as we know it today is characterized by an abrupt increase in the Earth's temperature. It is estimated to have gotten 1.2 to 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in just the last century. 10 out of the last 13 years were the warmest on record. 97% of climate scientists agree that this new tendency is not caused by the variations of the Earth's orbit, but rather very likely caused by human activities. That means you and me. And since the Industrial Revolution, we have come a long way. Humans built airplanes, faster cars, developed remarkable technology, and learned how the natural resources around us can be used for our benefit. Although this has led to many wonderful inventions and advancements, like the device you're using to watch this video, or the ability to take a plane halfway around the world, it also means we've increased our consumption of natural resources and, in turn, released a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now, greenhouse gases occur naturally, but in excess can be dangerous to our planet. Modern human activities have increased the release of non-naturally occurring greenhouse gases because we have stepped up our demand for burning fossil fuels. The composition of greenhouse gases traps heat radiated from the sun. The more heat they trap, the warmer our planet gets. And as our planet gets warmer, we begin to feel the effects. One of climate change's biggest victims is our oceans. Oceans regulate the Earth's temperature and provide 50% of the Earth's oxygen. Now, climate change has increased the global temperature of the oceans by more than 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1969. Although a warmer ocean might seem inviting to a beachgoer, it actually has devastating consequences for supporting life at sea. One of those consequences is ocean acidification, a direct effect of increased dissolved CO2. Since the late 18th century, ocean surface acidification has increased by 30%. A higher acid content means calcifying species, like oysters and clams and shallow water corals, are at risk, putting the entire ocean food web at risk. This is bad news for the 1 billion people relying on the ocean as its primary source of protein. Climate change has also caused the sea level to rise. Just in the last century, sea levels have risen 6.7 inches, but the rate in the last decade has nearly doubled. Sea levels have risen because as the ocean gets warmer, it swells. On top of that, glaciers and ice sheets are melting. Antarctica lost 36 cubic miles of ice between 2002 and 2005, and since 1994, each year on average, the Earth has lost 400 billion tons from its glaciers. That's like an ice cube 7.5 kilometers on a side, 4 miles on a side, melting and flowing into the sea. When all that ice melts, it fills up our oceans, and just like filling up a bathtub, the shores can't hold all that water, and coastal regions get flooded. Troubling signs of climate change are increased extreme weather events. Natural disasters like floods, tornadoes, and deadly heat waves are more obvious to humans because of their immediate impact and their sharing of the images in the media. Climate change, as we know it today, is change in our Earth's overall temperature with massive and permanent ramifications. Although its consequences can be planet-threatening, scientists still believe there are things we can do on a personal level to help. Recycle and reuse things. Walk or use public transportation to get to work. Turn off your electronics when you're not using them. Eat less meat. While you're at it, eat more locally grown vegetables and foods. And last but not least, spread your knowledge and concerns about climate change with others. When it comes to climate change, the main takeaway is that it's real. And although we are part of the cause, we can also be part of the solution.
So again, that was Bill Nye on National Geographic talking about climate change and where, we are in the middle of the woods in this sense, but we still have some things that we can do to improve our position with climate change. But I hate to be the cynic in the room, folks, but there is also a lot of things that have already changed the climate that we do not have control over, that we already are going to feel the repercussions of as it stands right now. And this is an article from CNBC.com by Robert Ferris, a really good read. Arctic sea ice is vanishing far faster than anyone thought possible. I want to get into that. There's plenty of evidence, and there's plenty, just tons and tons of good stuff in here. So I'm just going to be doing a lot of quote reading here. Arctic sea ice is melting at a rate far faster than anyone has thought, and it's already wildly and perhaps permanently changing the region and the planet. Historically, sea ice forms every winter across the top of the planet and often covers much of the Arctic Ocean. Every summer, the ice melts a bit and retreats, only to repeat the cycle again. But since the 1980s, the ice has been retreating further and further overall, contributing to the sea level rise, changes to ecosystems, and erosion so severe it's biting off chunks of the coastlines in Alaska, Canada, and elsewhere. As 2016 continues to outpace and be one of the warmest years on record, Arctic sea ice levels appear to be among the lowest on record, said Tom Wagner, who is the program manager for NASA's Cryosphere Research, a name given to study the frozen regions of the planet. It doesn't look like the ice is healing or growing back. Quote, by some accounts, we have lost more than 2/3 of the ice that used to be back in the 1980s, Wagner has said. This looks to be a very, very long-term trend, and we're only going to be losing more and more ice. This matters because the health of the ice is often considered a general indicator of what's going on in the Earth's total climate system. Wagner continues, this is not something that will affect humanity in the far-off future. Loss of this ice is already wildly changing the Arctic. Wagner continues again, the planet is not just changing, it has changed, and we have to deal with that change and how it's occurred. The melting of the glaciers in Alaska and Canada and in Greenland is already raising sea levels to the point that Miami and New York are experiencing flooding. And this is something that I wanted to continue on too, is it's a fact that climate change is affecting our planet. It's an absolute fact. We know this to be true. We know that we are seeing huge shifts. We know that people who have been there before that are making the measurements have seen rapid changes in the measurements, and they've had separate independent groups evaluate that evidence again and come to the same conclusions repetitively. I mean, this is a solid observation that's going on in real time here. And so what do we do when we're faced with people that deny climate change? that are climate change deniers in a sense. And this is an IFL Science article that I thought was really, really important, something that you guys can share. I'm not going to share all 12 ways here, but they give us 12 ways to deal with a climate change denier, and it says it's the barbecue guide, which I thought was kind of cute. But it leads in with, the end of the year is nigh, and it's time for Christmas and the New Year parties and gatherings. In the southern hemisphere, that means barbecues and beaches. In the northern hemisphere, it's mulled wine and cozy fireplaces. But for all of us, it probably means we'll be subjected to at least one long, ranting, fact-free sermon by a typical climate change denier. And it says, they kind of short it and just say, typical climate change deniers, TCCD. So, it kind of gives you the idea of what they're going to be talking about here. But they do have some things that I think are very important. Number one, pick your audience. Most TCCDs will not change their mind. It's cheaper intellectually and socially for them to stand their ground than it is to change their views. And actually arguing with them may even reinforce their beliefs. But remember, you might convince the friends that are listening in. And I think that is the biggest part of almost every argument that you engage with someone. Think about it that way, is the dial of the conversation and where it's going is actually the room. It's the audience around you. It's not really the person you're debating. For instance, if someone is having a debate, a public debate, there's two individuals that are up front. They're taking turns, taking shots at each other and presenting their arguments. And they're not really trying to convince the person they're arguing with about their position. They're convincing the audience that's listening in passively what their position is. And I think that's an important thing to note. And here in the global warming debate, if you're trying to engage with somebody, it's the exact same reasoning. It's the exact same idea, is think about the audience that you're around. If you're around a bunch of people that you don't think it's worth having the argument, don't have the argument, folks, by all means. 2, find some common ground. Just because you have some climate change deniers and they think they know better than pretty much all of science, it doesn't mean that they're a bad person, which is obvious. They value things, and their values are probably well-intentioned at the heart. So we have to think that too. It's not like somebody thinks that there's it's not cynical what their beliefs are. And certainty isn't the issue. This is another one that I thought was important. Climate change deniers must say we don't understand the climate change, and we don't understand it with 100% certainty, so we shouldn't do anything. And they're right about the first point, but utterly wrong about the second. Climate change science isn't 100% certain, but neither is medicine, the law, child rearing, or pretty much anything else. We make decisions without certainty every day. Complete certainty is pretty much never required for action. So in this sense, it's not about trying to have certainty. So you can think about it in this way. You can ask the person this: what's worse, if the majority of climate change scientists are wrong, and we act anyway, or climate change deniers are wrong and we don't? So put it on a scale and say, okay, let's pretend that everything they said is absolutely wrong and it's bull. Is the world worse off because we've gone out of using carbon emissions and we've moved towards more renewable energies? Did that actually impact the world in a negative way for making this jump? And what would happen if we didn't do anything, and how would that play out? And I think that's just a good way of getting people to kind of rationalize it. And there's a big important factor here. 97% of climate scientists agree humans are causing global warming. Now, if you want to focus on the 3%, that's fine. We can definitely talk in mass about how there's certainly 3% of global warming scientists that say that they doubt about climate change. Most of them in the Meteorological Society. That group of folks really has a lot of different opinions on climate change and what its impacts are. So that is legitimate. But you have to stack that up with relevancy and percentage. 3 out of 100. And what's the likelihood if everyone is studying and looking at the same thing, and only 3 out of 100 come to one conclusion, 97 out of 100 come to the other? This is about studying the evidence too. This is not an ad populum argument. This is saying people that are looking at the evidence have come to these conclusions. That's some strong evidence right there. And just wait for someone to say, this is number 8 in the article, wait for someone to say it's all a big conspiracy theory. I think that's the big one. Wait for them to say it's all a big conspiracy theory. Really? The idea that the international conspiracy has gone across dozens of disciplines, hundreds of institutions, and thousands of individuals is honestly laughable. If the world's climate scientists were so good at conspiracy, they'd be better off using their astounding Machiavellian skills to rig an election or clean up the stock market. The other thing they could be using it for is getting bought off by big oil. If it's a money game, why can't big oil buy them off and get them to change their mind? So I just don't believe that concept. There's plenty more there. 12 things that you can say to a climate change denier on IFL Science. Thank you guys for listening to Paleo Radio. We appreciate it very much. Jeremiah Bannister is going to be back in September.
Paleo Radio, exclusively with Secular Media Group.